For a few decades, about a century ago, the world's largest Tennessee whiskey company was owned and operated by a Jew. To find out more about this story, let's check out this newest episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, and I am very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Clay Schwab.
Hello. How are you doing?
Oh, good. How are you?
I'm doing great.
All right. So for those less familiar with Clay here, he has taught business management, senior thesis, and management in literature at Maryville College for 10 years after a business career at Whittle Communications, Snyder Communications, and Edison Schools. He is the great-grandson of V.E. Manny Shwab. He is the author of Manny Shwab and the George Dickel Company, Whiskey, Power, and Politics During Nashville's Gilded Age. He lives in Maryville, Tennessee. So welcome, Clay.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And so we mentioned this book. We wouldn't be here without this book. So as we mentioned, you are the great-grandson of Manny Shwab, right? Is that what we said?
No, great-grandson. And
great-grandson. But we're going to also be talking about your great-great-grandfather.
Right.
I was reading this book, and I have some interesting questions. But the reason we're talking about this in the first place is it was started by it's George Dickel, I think, is a whiskey that people are familiar with, a Tennessee whiskey that people are familiar with, and sort of an enduring brand out there, and was started by a Jew, by your great-grandfather.
Also, George Dickel was my great-granduncle. They married sisters.
Oh, right. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yes. Before we get to the actual title character of this story, your great-grandfather, I want to first talk about your great-great-grandfather. So he was an immigrant from Alsace-Lorraine. Is that correct?
Yes, he was born in 1818. He immigrated in 1841 at the age of 22, and he became a citizen in Philadelphia in 1842.
He was living. It seems to be that he came to America and lived in primarily 3 states: Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. Is that correct?
Yes, he moved around a lot, and I had a rabbi from the Temple Bethel tell me that was fairly common back then. And Abraham lived in Youngstown in 1842, Youngstown, Ohio, and then moved to Louisville in 1850. Then 1848 went to Nashville, then 1850 went to Louisville, then 1853 through 54 went back to Nashville, and by 1855 he was in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he in each of those places he started a imported French wine, champagne companies, successful ones in all of those cities.
It's interesting because one thing I cannot help but think about is that him as an immigrant Jew to this country was it because he still had networks of friends or family back in Europe that he was more easily, like a sense of trust to be able to import these products?
Yeah, that's speculation, but I'm fairly positive that he was using his connections in France to introduce these brandies, especially brandy and even absinthe, to the South. Once he got into Nashville and Knoxville, and he wasn't quite familiar with all the rules. We can get to him selling to a slave in a little bit, but
that incident. But
I think he came for opportunity. I mean, what was. You probably know better than I do what was going on in France at the time. I mean, 1791, Jews got emancipation, rights to full citizenship in France. But then in 1806, Napoleon instigated a moratorium on where Jews could live and what they could do and limit their lending of money, because over 30% of the mortgages were held by Jews at that time. And I have a feeling that atmosphere and the opportunities it could possibly be in America was the impetus for him to come here. Pretty brave.
What?
Pretty brave.
Yeah. I mean, I can't help. So there's a really interesting book by a professor at, I think, Georgia State University. Her name is Professor Marnie Davis. So she came out with a book like a dozen years ago called Jews and Booze, but it was about Jews basically in the 19th and the early 20th century, and how the reason that a lot of Jews, especially in the late 19th century, so that's what we're talking about, a lot of Jews got involved, especially in distilling, but in booze more generally in America, was because similar, like a lot of Jews were largely closed off from a lot of occupations when they were in Europe. And so a lot of them turned to money lending, but also alcohol. And so when they came to America, and now I'm thinking about your great 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 grandfather, when he came to America, I wonder if he had that in his background. He had it maybe in his family. They were involved. One, whether producers or retailers or distributors, that they were involved in the alcohol industry. So coming to America was an opportunity for him to tap into his networks.
Alsatia, which is where he was from, Alsatian, is a heavy wine community. I mean, it's a wine section. And throughout his and then Manny's life, they were importing from France. And Mild Sauerkraut, we can get to later, he would spend 3 or 4 months a year in France buying alcohol for the George Dickel Company and sending it back. He was a part.
Wow. Did you mention a couple of minutes ago about introducing brandy and absinthe to the South?
Well, I would assume that he was one of the first companies to be doing that. I mean, I don't know that for positive, but there was a lot of whiskey being consumed in the South. There was a lot of beer being consumed, and a lot of Germans, Jewish Germans, bringing over different types of beer. But champagne and liqueurs aren't something that people talk about a lot, during that period of time. And I think the uniqueness of it was probably part of his draw, why he was very successful.
You're right, because wine was not a big product in the mid to late 19th century in general in America. And so I can imagine, especially like a distilled wine for brandy would be even less so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And he sold cigars also.
That's good. There's a couple other interesting, not drinking related facts, but I think it was also really fascinating for me to read about in your book of his going first. I think it was like the first wedding, also the first divorce of the first Jewish wedding, first divorce in Knoxville, which is some interesting Jewish Tennessee history, I imagine. And you were also saying Nashville, he was involved, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And he had stores at the same time in Nashville and in Knoxville. His oldest son, Joseph, about 4 days after Tennessee succeeded, he joined the Confederacy. In 1862, he died of typhoid. And Abraham went to Winchester, Virginia, where he had been in some battles with Lee and Jackson. And he retrieved the body and brought it back to Knoxville. Problem was there wasn't anywhere to bury him. And so 2 gentlemen there donated a small plot of land so that he could have a grave, and that became the first graveyard in Knoxville. It's still there. It's a little tiny graveyard.
First Jewish graveyard.
First Jewish graveyard.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then his daughter was the first Jewish bride in Knoxville. She was also the second Jewish bride in Knoxville.
Right.
That's a story all unto itself.
Yeah, that was I don't want to get into that, but that is definitely a really curious set of stories in the book around her. I think you were also saying Abraham was, whichever town he went to, he was always involved or maybe a starter of whether it's synagogues or other Jewish activities, right?
Yes, in Youngstown, he was president of the first congregation. Then in Louisville, he was president of the first congregation. In Nashville, he was members of put together the first minions because they want a rabbi, and then he became the president of the Magen David Society there. And in Knoxville, he was he would participate in minions there because they had no rabbi as well. And so he was, according to the temple. There's a temple here in Knoxville called Temple Bethel, and they give people a little flyer, a little 2-page flyer. And I didn't know this when I started writing the book, and there was all this stuff written up about Abraham Schwab and what his family was like, and the impact that he had on the community. When I first started writing this book, I was living here in Knoxville. I had no idea Abraham was buried here. I had no idea that Abraham Schwab was my great-great-grandfather until I started doing research on this book. My family had never really talked about the history of the family, of any side of the family, really. And so
So
it was all news to me. And I found out that a mile away, my great uncle was buried.
wow.
So that was interesting.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I want to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode on different types of beverages in the Bible.
It's a question of, okay, are we referring to something that is fermented, fermenting? I think the reason why it's often rendered sweet wine, as you'll see in some English translations, is because of a recognition that it's sugary still.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring various biblical beverages. Now back into this episode on the Dickel brand. I know I want to talk about your great grandfather, although I've been enjoying hearing about your great great grandfather, but I want to take sort of an excursion to talk about how you came about writing this book and also researching this book, because a lot of it seems like it's from newspaper clippings and other sort of archival research. So how did you first decide to start researching this, and what did the process entail for you?
Well, I had just a little curiosity about where some money had come from in my family that wasn't there anymore. But talked to my grandmother, who her honeymoon was 3 months in the Waldorf Astoria in New York.
Wow.
And their family members, there were 5 family members with these giant mansions in Belmead and Nashville.
Huh.
And I would spend long periods of time with her, asking, where we would just talk, because I went over there every week and stayed with her. And she would mention this V.E. Schwab and the George Dickel Company. I found out that we had owned it one time. And she told me a couple of stories about it, but I never really thought about it much until about a dozen years ago. My son Riley told me, hey, there's a whiskey blog where the guy's talking about our family. And so I checked it out. It was Chuck Cowdery, who the New York Times tapped as the Dean of American Whiskey Writers.
Wow.
And he was bemoaning the fact that American distillers weren't celebrating or promulgating the true rich histories of their distilleries. That instead, they were creating these advertising models, these fake models, for promotion purposes, and really not letting people understand what the real true history of the distilleries were. And the example he gave was the George Dickel Company.
Wow.
He said the George Dickel Company has created this Keebler elf image for George Dickel, and there must be a V.E. Schwab descendant out there somewhere who would want to correct the record. And I said, well, I qualify for the descendant part, but I don't know squat about the record. So I thought I would start looking into it a little bit, and I did. And as I became more and more fascinated with this guy, I started off with his obituary, and it turned out that it was obituaries because it was in multiple newspapers, front page news, 2 columns long. And they were all about the richest man in Nashville, one of the richest in the South. He was director of 3 railroads. He was the founder and director of 4 banks. He was the president and founder of Cumberland Telephone and Telegraph Company, which became Bell South. He was the president of the first of the electric and light company in Nashville. He owned over a dozen downtown properties. He owned the George Dickel Company, which was the largest importer of anything in the town, and the #1 distillery in the country. I mean, in the state, Cascade Whiskey. And he owned. I could go on and on about that. So I thought, well, gosh, this guy was, prominent and well respected. He was a philanthropist. He was in all this. There's a school now called Schwab School, elementary school, home of the Swabbies. He was not respected all the way around. I found out that there was a dark side to this guy. That he was known by the Republicans as the debaucher of more young men in the state than any other person because of his whiskey and saloons. That he was the owner of Tennessee politics for 40 years. That he was constantly being accused of bribing politicians in order to, and that he was dictating who got to run for governor or mayor or chief of police or whatever. So there was a dark side to him as well.
Mhm.
So that got me, okay. I think there's a story here. And I reached out to Ridley Wills in Nashville. And Ridley is a historian who's written over 30 books on Nashville. He and I got to be real friends. He's way up in years now. But he told me, Clay, you've got to tell this story. And I went to Tennessee Historical Quarterly. It's been around for 150 years. And the editor of it, when I was telling her about this story, she said, this story will really fill a gap in the Tennessee literature. So, because nowhere could I find in any of the histories, in the state library, the National Archives, in the history books that I read, about Nashville and about Nashville business, not one mention of this guy. How is that possible? I went to his grave in Nashville, where he's buried with George Dickel, and they're all the same family. I promised him I would get his name out there. So that's what I'm doing here today.
Avram, definitely, your great-great-grandfather definitely had a connection to his Jewish identity. It sounds like Manny from this book, I mean, you mentioned obituaries. He ultimately does not stay a Jew, right? He converts to some sort of Christianity.
Yeah, I think his wife convinced him to do that. The rest of his family remained. Emil, his brother, buried in a Jewish cemetery in Louisville. His brother-in-law, Meyer Salzkater, and nephew are buried in the temple graveyard in Nashville. And the rest of his family, Harry, also remained Jewish. But I don't think he was really Christian. I think he was just nothing when it comes to
like maybe it was good for business or politics.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you? I mean, that's something. Maybe I missed it in this book. Did you find out anything? Like, I know you speculated maybe it was through his wife's convincing. Did you find anything related to sort of his religious leanings?
No, I didn't. Just I know that he was brought up in the Jewish tradition by his father. Sure.
Yeah.
And he was close to his father and his family, at least up until 1870. And when he was 20 or 21 years old, and it may have been that, his wife said, we get married in a church, I don't get married, something like that. I have no idea, though. I mean, it's than that.
Okay. I was curious about that.
I remain curious about it.
Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. If you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode.
We're here because obviously we've got the whiskey. He doesn't start. He acquires Cascade whiskey. Is that correct?
Well, right after it began, it starts with the smuggling. Okay, Nashville was occupied by the Union Army from the beginning of the war throughout the war.
Yeah,
and there's a couple of books written about that occupation. But John Fitch was the provost judge. He wrote about this nest of Nashville smugglers. And after Joseph died and was buried in Nashville, his son-in-law, Meyer Salzkater, and he created a fleet of false bottom wagons in Nashville and consistently would run gray caps, whiskey, and medicines and guns and knives through the Union lines to Louisville, Atlanta, and Knoxville and back, earning the equivalent today of $60,000 per run with multiple wagons, multiple times a week throughout the war. I mean, wow. And so they accumulated an enormous fortune of money to the point that Grant issued his order number 11. Are you familiar with that?
Vaguely. I know that it had something to do with Jews.
Because of the smuggling activity, said all Jews must leave Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky within one day, and they can only take with them what they can carry, and they have to give up their property and everything. Get them out of here because we can't stop them from the smuggling thing.
It sounds like he was like your grand whatever. The Schwabs were very catalytic for that, right?
Well, I'll get back to the provost, but 2 weeks later, Lincoln found out about it, was incensed, and rescinded the order. But in the book is a whole chapter on Schwab and Salzcotter smuggling through the lines, and he said it just proved impossible to stop these guys. And they caught one of them, sent him to prison, but he came back 8 days later because he had so much money. He paid the guards up in Pennsylvania, got out and came back. And he laughingly, and this is in the book, in Provost Jugg's book, that he laughingly said the Union soldiers never could find the cash, but it was they came within inches. Well, I say all this because they ran across this one distillery that seemed to have the best of the whiskey that they were running. And Manny at the time was like 16 or 17. So after the war, they started the George Dickel Company with a bootmaker, George Dickel, who was 48 years old, had been a bootmaker throughout the war, throughout the whole time he'd been there since 1844. And then immediately after the war, he was, lo and behold, a liquor dealer with the Schwab family. And where the money came from, where the knowledge of the whiskeys because they immediately were into French, bringing in the different stuff from France, all that got Manny interested in the business itself, of course. But he learned about this one whiskey, Cascade Hollow, in Tullahoma, which was a little tiny hamlet. And the whiskey there he thought was outstanding. And he ended up buying 2/3 of the distillery. And Key Davis had come up with this Mellow as Moonlight whiskey that where he comes from, he insisted that the charcoal be open air created, and you could never extinguish the charcoal with water. But then you had to cool the mash at night under the moon. And Manny was a genius at promotion. So he took the Mellow as Moonlight as a slogan, and ended up with the most famous Tennessee whiskey in the world at the time, and the most valuable distillery in the state. Where in 1909 it was the largest federal seizure in the history of the country when they moved down and seized it. He made a bloody fortune off that whiskey. I got to try a 109-year-old version of it that my family had stored away.
Yeah. Was it very smooth?
Mellow as Moonlight. I'll tell you how mellow it was. My sister states that she will only drink Miller Lite because everything else makes her misbehave. And we were invited by my cousin to sip this 109-year-old whiskey that they had stored away for all these years, and to bring out during baptisms or special occasions. My sister took a little sip of it, and her eyes just got huge. And went, I could drink this all day.
Wow.
It was that smooth. Somebody that never drank whiskey. And the flavors that came out were just amazing.
Okay, so it's the George Dickel Company, and they buy Cascade Distilling or whiskey. When do they come up with associating George Dickel with whiskey?
I know it was because of the cash that they had, and they had to somehow liquidate it. And Dickel was a German immigrant, and Meyer Salzcotter, Abraham's son-in-law, was a German immigrant. Abraham, of course, was a French immigrant, and they were all friends, and intermarried. The Dickel Company, the advertisements for the Dickel Company at the time were identical to the advertisements of Schwab and Company that had shown up in the Knoxville newspapers every week. And so they stayed with that formula for the business. until Manny bought Cascade. And once they bought Cascade, they became the sole distributor of that, and that's what they focused on.
Hmm.
And it became, again, the most valuable, according to the newspapers, the most valuable distillery in the state.
And so that was seized in the 1920s once Prohibition kicks in, right?
Well, it was 1909, once Prohibition kicked in Tennessee.
Oh, okay. So not the national one. So Tennessee.
2 days after the law passed, this IRS agent who wanted to be Elliot Ness came swooping in and took over the distillery because of their supposedly because of their failure to pay tax on all the alcohol. But Manny was good friends with the Attorney General of the United States.
Mhm.
Was able to have it turned back over to him 4 days later.
Oh.
But at the time, there were newspapers throughout Canada, throughout the United States that covered it. Big still taken in Tennessee, and
Wow.
what it was you're familiar with what the angel's share is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, in back then, a typical barrel of whiskey would hold 50 gallons,
Mm-hmm.
and at the time, every single major distillery had a government agent assigned to them that stayed there on site. And he would say, this is how many gallons are in this barrel, and this is how many gallons in that barrel.
Mm-hmm.
Well, once you finally, the aging process was over and you decided to sell it, the agent would say, okay, now there's 47 gallons in here. So you owe 47, tax on 47 gallons.
Yeah.
But what happens if it goes down to 30 gallons, where you still have to pay up to 40? You have to pay tax on 40 gallons. So what distilleries would do is, well, this one has 47 and this one has 38. I'll take 2 from here and put it over here. Because I'm not paying tax on alcohol that doesn't exist. So that's what they got him for, and it was bogus. But he ended up having to pay $10,000, and that was the end of that.
I'm now curious about the Tennessee move for Prohibition. Since he was very involved, especially in Nashville, but probably more broadly within Tennessee politics, did he make I don't know, like a counter push against the temperance movement within Tennessee?
Constantly, he was known for that, and
okay,
and that's what all the bribery accusations were about. Was he was placing people in politics who would support anti-prohibition causes, and they were the Democrats. And it was so divisive. People, you think today was divisive. The issue of prohibition in Tennessee, and I think in the whole country, was so divisive. The U.S. senator was shot and killed on downtown Nashville over the issue. In 1911, Manny had secured 6 votes from the Republicans that would have repealed the repeal, made liquor available again. 34 Republicans left the state and lived for the summer in 1911 in Decatur, Alabama, to keep them from having a quorum because they know they're going to lose. And all of it was because Manny had, and this is in the newspapers, Manny had secured 6 votes, and they were all saying, of course, he's giving these guys cases of whiskey, and that's what's going on here. Well, that's one example. I mean, I read hundreds of articles about Manny and about people accusing him of bribing the chief of police so that none of the saloons that he owned would be raided. The mayor and would come to his saloons, and they were saying that he was in his pocket all the time. But so he was known as the owner of Tennessee politics for 40 years. I mean, that's what they called it. Called him a one-man Tammany Hall.
Yeah.
He was, again, the debaucher of more young men than anyone else in the state. On that side. On the other side, he was a pinnacle of society, and he was very well accepted, owned all these properties, in downtown Nashville. And so anyway, I think it's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, it definitely is.
I'm really biased.
Yeah, for sure. I want to go back because he acquires Cascade in the early 1890s, right?
1888.
1888. And then when does it continue until?
Pardon?
Does it continue? So you mentioned 1909, it gets seized, but is he able to continue? How long is he able to run it until after 1909?
Okay, in 1911,
Mm.
they moved the distilling of it to Louisville, Kentucky,
Ah,
at Steisel. And Steisel was run by a man named Pappy Van Winkle. And,
yeah.
but Manny's two sons went to make sure that to oversee the distilling and make sure that the original formula was used and all that. And Pappy Van Winkle, who's a very well-known person in whiskey today, his whiskey still for over $1,000 a bottle.
Yeah.
1957, he said, yes, for a while we did distill the great Cascade whiskey. It's like it's not been seen since Prohibition.
Wow.
That's a heck of a stamp of approval.
Yeah.
On the whiskey, but yes, he was involved in it all the way to the end until Prohibition started.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother told me a story that the family gathered in 1937 in her home to decide what to do with the company now that it was legal again.
Mm-hmm.
And she said they were all so rich that they said it's just not socially prominent, let's just sell it. Idiots. I wouldn't be sitting here today if it was. Cascade dwarfed to Jack Daniels.
Mm-hmm.
In 1909, they said that in the newspaper when the distillery was taken over, the newspaper said that in order to let you know the significance of Cascade to our state, from 1905 to 1908, 25% of the taxes of all distilleries in Middle and East Tennessee and West Tennessee combined, Cascade whiskey paid. So
wow.
I mean, it was that large of a deal to the state.
So basically, for those, we'll call it 3 decades roughly, that your great grandfather owned and operated it. So it was the largest Tennessee whiskey in the world.
Yes,
it was the greatest Tennessee. It was a huge Tennessee whiskey product.
Yes, well, huge. I mean, when Manny died, Cascade Distillery burned to the ground while they were burying him. Just a coincidence. It was wildfires.
Just coincidence, really?
Coincidence.
Oh, interesting.
It's a big one. But newspapers in Canada and Los Angeles, Texas, everywhere covered the story. And they say the famous Cascade whiskey that lived up to its motto, "If mellow as moonlight," burned to the ground while the owner was being buried. And it was a newspaper. I mean, they all talked about the famous Cascade whiskey. I mean, and the reason for that, again, was Manny's uncanny ability to promote. He decided to take it international and founded an advertising agency that was brand new.
Mm-hmm.
The advertising agency had 2 clients at the time that they were going to take international. One was Cascade, and the other was another stimulating beverage, Coca-Cola.
Wow.
And DRC came up with these incredibly creative ads of how to get around Prohibition. That they would send you the whiskey in a box that nobody could tell from the outside that had liquor in it. It was all perfectly legal.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't want the black mark of it just had a case of whiskey over there at Mrs. Jones' house was delivered, and she's a sinner, that kind of thing. So.
Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right. Thank you so much. Now back into the show.
I'm kind of curious, it clearly showed, I mean, you mentioned the synagogue in Knoxville that you went to, and certainly the earlier part, you mentioned finding out some stuff Jewishly. I mean, was that interesting for you to?
I ended up talking to the rabbi at Temple Beth El about, how could I become a Jew? Yes, I mean, just the community. I mean, this guy came to this country and didn't know anyone. he was able to, I guess because of his personality, to create a community. And it was just how those folks got together and, in a country that, I mean, Youngstown, these were teeny little towns
Yeah.
at the time. And how they created their own sense of communities, and they would work together. I mean, you can read the newspaper. Again, I read 225 newspaper articles are cited in the book. Just over and over again, the sense of community. I mean, like the people coming together and donating land for his son to be buried, and the support that Meyer Salstar got after he was arrested. And I mean, it's just example after example of the community aspect of it was fascinating to me. Personally, really.
Wait, this is a freshly published book, right? It's 2024, right?
Yeah, yes, and if you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Target, you can get it on Barnes and Noble, but you ought to get it from me because it's cheaper, and I'll sell it. And you can get it from bellowismoonlight.com.
There we go.
C Schwab, no C in my last name.
Yeah.
And I want to mention that too.
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, you mentioned, I think it was like census records, that it wasn't just Manny. I think even his father would drop the C, right?
In 1848, in the city directory in Nashville, it was SHWAB. Thereafter, when it was SCHWAB in the U.S. Census, etc. But then in 1870, Abraham Schwab in Youngstown, Ohio again, Abraham was SHWAB. And that same year, Manny for the first time was SHWAB. I'm speculating that it had something to do with phonetics. You know, because when I was growing up, it was hammered in my head. Our name is not Schwab, it's Swab. Okay. And you know, so it may be because in French, H is silent, but I have a feeling that, you know, he may have wanted to speak it Swab, something like that. You know, it's Swab. And I'm guessing. I'm just guessing.
So you're saying it was a family tradition regarding the pronunciation of it?
Yes. And I thought
it's a silent H.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And my parents would, I mean, my father, I can't tell you how many times I heard him come and say, Mr. Schwab. And so I thought it was just our family in this generation, but I think it goes all the way back.
Wow. Huh. I would never have guessed. I figured the H is doing something there. Okay. All right. Well, this is great. Clay, this has been really insightful, especially having read the book, being able to ask you questions and finding out a little bit further beyond what was in the pages, but also this is great. And obviously people who are interested in, we'll call it 3 decades, really the most significant Tennessee whiskey in the world, and sort of the Jewish founder behind it.
I want to also give you accolades for what you're doing here, because I think it's just fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Nothing about Jewish drinking, but there's so many interesting nuances and topics. So keep it up.
I appreciate that so much, Clay. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. I appreciate that. And l'chaim. Thank you.
Okay.